Salutations, ladies and gentlemen of the internet. I'm Grega, and I have seen the Acolyte episode 4. And I've got to say, I think this is as bad as episode 3. I know a lot of reviewers have said that it's not as bad as episode 3, and that episode 3 is the ne plus ultra for weapons grade cringe that can't possibly be topped, but I don't think so. I think this episode really reaches the same levels of awfulness as its predecessor, though maybe for slightly different reasons. For one thing, this episode is exactly what we thought it was going to be based on the reports and the reviews that came out before this episode dropped on Tuesday of this week. It was pretty heavily reported by reviewers who had seen this episode early that this episode was going to push the they-them pronouns bullshit, and that is, of course, improperly using the plural pronouns of they and them to refer to an individual to code them as being non-binary, which is not a real thing, of course. But this is not the first time that Disney's Star Wars has done this kind of shit. I actually made a video about a month ago about Disney Star Wars doing just this with one of their animated shows. It's called Tales of the Empire, I believe. But the Acolyte episode 4 is really, really remarkable because really nothing happens in this episode, but it still manages to reach the same levels of awfulness that we saw in episode 3. The plot, so far as there is one, is that it begins with May and the middleman to her master, who more talented YouTubers than I have referred to as Asian Ezra Miller, on this planet to hunt for Kalnaka, the Wookiee Jedi who is on May's hit list. And while they're on this planet, May starts to get cold feet about the seemingly insurmountable task of killing a Jedi without a weapon, which is one of the requirements for becoming an Acolyte, and she just doesn't think it can be done. And so since she thinks this, she then decides that since her sister's alive, she'll just turn herself into the Jedi and be done with it. She wants to turn good, basically. And so she sets a trap for Asian Ezra Miller in the jungle. It's this wire trap that ties to this limb of a tree. And so she ties him by the leg. He's hanging from his tree, swinging around, and she runs off to find Kalnaka. I said in my episode 3 review that they were setting up May to be sympathetic down the road, but it turns out it's much worse than this, because they are trying to make this evil character, this murderer, good. It's completely unearned. It just comes out of nowhere, and it's just risible. Concurrently with May and Asian Ezra Miller being boring in the middle of the jungle, we have Osha and the Jedi being boring in the middle of the jungle, because the Jedi arrive on the planet to apprehend May, and they know that she is going after Kalnaka, so the Jedi track their way to Kalnaka's home with the help of this weird gopher alien guy. So the Jedi and May find their way to Kalnaka's place. May gets there first, and when she arrives, she sees that Kalnaka has been killed. He has a lightsaber slash across his chest. Then the episode ends with the Jedi surrounding Kalnaka's home, telling May to come out like they're the LAPD or something. And then May's master floats into the scene. He ignites a red lightsaber. The Jedi turn theirs on. They charge after Smilo Ren, and then Smilo Ren force pushes them away. Then the credits roll. You know, for an episode this bare bones and simple, you'd think that it would be impossible to fuck it up, but they do an A1 job of it. And this episode, I think, is as bad as its predecessor for a couple reasons. Number one, the pronoun bullshit. I think I'll get into that right now. That little gopher alien guy who I mentioned, who helps the Jedi track their way to Kalnaka's home. His name's Basil, and he's introduced during this scene on this spaceship en route to the planet where Kalnaka lives. During this scene, May sees him, and then she turns to the Padawan and asks, "Is he or they with us?" We all know why Disney and Lucasfilm put this line of dialogue into this episode. They want to push the preferred pronoun propaganda, and it's so blatantly obvious, even though the writer of this episode did go on X and claim that it was meant as a joke about pronouns, which No, it wasn't. Number one, it's not funny. And two, we know what Disney and Lucasfilm's politics are. They don't make it any secret, and they grind that political axe just relentlessly. So we all know what this is. The claim that this is a joke is pure gaslighting. Another reason why I think episode 4 is as bad as episode 3 is, frankly, I think it looks worse than episode 3. Now, to be fair, the entire show looks bad. It looks artificial. It looks cheap. Everything looks like it was shot on a soundstage. I know. But episode 3 was mainly in interior settings, and so things looking stagey, it's not quite as egregious there. It's really terrible when you're in exterior settings. When you're in the middle of a jungle, like in episode 4, you don't want it to look like it was shot on a soundstage, but that's how it looks here. And occasionally you get the majestic vista shot, but there is so obviously CGI inserted into it. It's so clear where the actual foliage ends and the computer generated foliage begins, and it's just an eyesore. And the other reason why this episode at least lives up to episode 3's awfulness is because this episode includes a character who should not even be alive at the time that the Acolyte is supposed to take place. And I'm of course talking about Ki-Adi-Mundi, who's one of my favorite background characters from the prequel films. Early in this episode, before Osha and the Jedi go after May, there are a couple of scenes that take place in the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, and during one of these scenes, Ki-Adi-Mundi shows up. How that is, I have no idea, because Ki-Adi-Mundi is not even supposed to be alive during the time period of the Acolyte. And at first I thought it was just some other Saurian Jedi who looks remarkably similar to Ki-Adi-Mundi, but no, it turns out this is him, and this is confirmed in this article on the official Star Wars website. And what's so hilarious is that after this episode came out, Wikipedia was scrambling, re-editing articles, trying to make sense of the timeline muddlefuck caused by this episode, and predictably the shills were apologizing for it left and right, saying that this makes sense for this reason or that reason, but anyone with a fifth of a brain knows they done fucked up on this one. So the Acolyte episode 4 is an episode where nothing happens, it looks worse than all the rest, they try to turn the villain good out of nowhere, and characters who have no business being in this episode show up. You know, I was not sure if I wanted to continue reviewing the Acolyte after episode 3. If you saw my review of that episode, you'd know that. But after witnessing the weapons grade cringe of this episode that absolutely lives up to its predecessor, I say, bring on episode 5. So that about wraps it up. I'm Grega, and you all look after yourselves. Cheers.